Hey guys, this is Jesse with averagejesse.com, and I wanted to revisit my last episode where I talked about the desert gardening hacks and show how some of those were working through last summer to now. It's early May 2020. And I also wanted to give kind of a yard tour and talk about some of the plants that I have here, some of the trees specifically, and how they fare in the full sun and how they've managed with some of the shade measures that I did last year. So let's go take a look. So this first tree is an Esperanza, and it's not edible, but it makes yellow flowers that bring in a lot of bees that pollinate some of my other crops. But this is a fast grower, and every year I chop it down, and the branches are small enough around that they fit in my wood chipper, and I use it for mulch in the fall. But this was chopped down almost to the ground in November, and by the end of the year, it will be up above my block wall. So I grow this mainly for the pollinators and as my fall mulch source. So this stick behind me used to be a strawberry tree or a Jamaican cherry. My previous neighbors before they moved put down some pre-emergent, and this particular tree is really sensitive to it, and it did not survive the winter after defoliating after that pre-emergent was sprayed. So I'm gonna have to replant it because the kids really liked it. However, there was some goji berry that I had planted down in that same well, and that goji berry is just growing like crazy in full sun. So I decided to leave it here until I can get this cropped out, and then I'll go ahead and replace that tree. But it's definitely high on the priority list for replacement. First edible plant here is this Cadota fig. This also defoliated with that pre-emergent spray last year, but it's coming back really nicely this year. I definitely noticed that spraying the leaves with some worm tea helped to thicken up the leaves. This particular Cadota is not my favorite as far as flavor is concerned, but it's growing so well that I'm going to use it to graft other varieties onto. I think they're really pretty. They defoliate in the winter, and I take all the leaves and I vacuum them up and turn them into mulch for the base of this tree as well. So I definitely think that a fig was good, but perhaps not this particular variety. Here we have an Australian finger lime, and I had this in a container for about 2 years, and it survived, but it didn't really do anything impressive. I moved it into the ground this spring, and it immediately shot out a ton of new growth. The color changed, and it's generally looked happier. And it has some little tiny finger limes on it that I really hope stay on, and I'm able to harvest them. I haven't tried this yet, but even though this says that it can be grown in a container, it has obviously been much happier since I put it in the ground. So this here is a red Malaysian guava, and this is one of my favorite trees in my entire yard. The fruit is amazing. I think it's a beautiful tree. The new growth has this really pretty pink foliage before it turns into this green. It flowers like crazy. It's a prolific fruiter. If I had to go back and start over again, I would have planted more than just one variety of guava because these are fantastic, and they take the full sun, and it's just a delight to come out here and see this tree. Here's an example of the fruit sets. We've got 3 little guavas right here that are growing well, and I'll know that this is ready when it turns from green to a more yellow color, and I can kind of squeeze it a little bit. But yeah, I can't wait to eat these. Here's one that's almost ripe. The color has changed a little bit, and it's about the size of my hand, so this one in a couple of days will be ready for harvest. So this here is a Moro blood orange, and I originally planted this to shade the loquat on this side from the afternoon sun. And it hadn't set fruit in the 2 years since I put it in the ground, except for this last spring. It finally set a couple of fruits. I haven't tried this yet, but it succeeded. It's grown quite tall and is effectively shading the loquat over here, so it's doing its job. And I think every house in the Phoenix metro area probably should, if it doesn't already, have some kind of citrus. It grows really well here, but nobody in my family was growing a blood orange, so obviously that was the natural selection for my house once we moved in here. Continuing the theme of loquat protection, I planted this passion fruit. This is a Frederick's variety to reduce the heat coming off of that block wall onto the loquat, and that has since moved out through all the rest of the trees. This thing has been prolific, and it sets little fruits all over the place. They're like Easter eggs trying to find where the passion fruits are. But it has effectively snaked its way back all along this wall, which is exactly what I wanted it to do, because as you can imagine, the summer heat on this wall radiates on all the trees, and that passion vine handles it really well. So that was a good addition. I wish I would have put a trellis on this wall before I planted it, but it seems to have found its way up on top of the wall by itself. Now, as you might imagine, all of that work to protect this loquat means that this particular tree is pretty special to me. It was the first tree that I planted that was somewhat exotic. It was the one that I've gone through the most trouble of shading in the summertime and feeding, and it's the showpiece, and people always ask what it is when they come into the backyard. This is a champagne loquat, and this is actually a seedling. I've had it in the ground for 4 years, and I have not had any fruit on it yet. So if I were to go back and do it again, I would have planted a grafted loquat first so I could have fruit faster, and then planted a seedling, because the seedlings are a little more resistant to the summer sun. They're a little hardier in my experience, but you just have to wait, and I'm super impatient. But I absolutely adore this tree, and I would sacrifice everything else in my yard to make sure that this thing keeps on going. Now we can see here, we've got the passion vine that's running through it, and one of my strategies last year was to have this passion vine all the way through it to help block some of the sun. It did a pretty good job. Last year I did not shade protect this tree, and I'm planning on doing the same this year, leaving this one exposed and seeing if it makes it through again. It's really important to have the mulch down here. This thing is shaded all on the western side from that harsh afternoon sun. And then the vine, like I said, does just enough to keep this thing going through the summer. Okay, continuing on, we've got a Suriname cherry here. And the Suriname cherry, it's got pretty new growth. It's nice and deep red, kind of like the guava. And it's not a bad looking bush, but other than a couple of flowers, it really hasn't done much. This was a rooted cutting, and this has been in the ground for over 3 years, and it's not a bad looking bush, but I'm not super thrilled with it. So I guess if I had to do it again, maybe if I had some spare space, but this here prime real estate right in the middle of my yard, I don't know if it was necessarily a good use for this Suriname cherry, but little by little it keeps growing. We'll see if it does anything this year. Okay, now that my phone has had a chance to cool down, I can tell you about the moringa tree. Even if you have a black thumb, this thing will grow in minimal water, in full sun, in poor soil. This is also called the drumstick tree or the tree of life. It's grown all throughout the world, and it's probably the second most common tree behind citrus that I see in a lot of the backyards around this community, so it's definitely gaining in popularity. If I had to plant this over again, I would have planted it on the far west corner of my property to shade out some of the rest of the trees during the summer. But as it stands right now, I love this tree, and it's something that I think really every yard should have one of. And next to the moringa, we have an Indian thornless jujube. This is not the Chinese jujube. This has kind of an egg-shaped green fruit that is crunchy, kind of like an apple, but tastes kind of like an apple mixed with a pear. This was a little tiny stick when I planted it about 2 years ago, and now it's probably 10, maybe 12 feet tall. This has been a real prolific grower. It takes the full sun. Even though it says thornless, it does have some little thorns on there. You kind of need to be careful about that. If I had to do this again, I probably wouldn't have planted it so close to the moringa, because I think they shade each other out a little bit. So I probably would space these out a bit more. But this plant, I have to prune it back a lot because it's super vigorous and it shades out some other trees. So if you're gonna have a dense planting, just know that you're gonna have to give this one a haircut pretty regularly. Here we have a desert gold peach, and a lot of people have peaches, but one thing I wanted to point out is that I got these vole cages on Amazon, vole, V-O-L-E, and they're better than organza bags because they're metal and they'll prevent the birds from getting through here. Another thing I would mention is I used to have a Bonanza dwarf peach here, and the fruit was delicious, but there wasn't a lot of it. So what this tree has taught me is not to plant dwarf trees.
And next to the peach, we have a New Zealand lemonade tree. This is a lemon that you can eat like an orange. It's not sour, it's actually got a sweet flavor to it. This is not an ideal spot for this tree, but it was the only spot in my yard that I had left. I actually planted this about a month ago and it's just gone to flower, so I don't really have a whole lot to mention about this one other than the fact that it exists and it seemed pretty novel, so it might be something to look for.
So this big guy here is a dwarf everbearing mulberry. And dwarf clearly is not in the size of the tree, it's in the size of the fruit. They're about the size of a blackberry. This tree is super prolific. It is a huge producer. It takes full sun. It gives a lot of leaves for mulch in the fall when this defoliates. And all in all, I really like this tree. The one thing that I would do differently is once this fruit season is over, I'm gonna trim this way down to be more like a bush. It is so prolific, if you don't keep up on it, it just litters the ground with mulberries. And I don't have chickens or anything that are gonna come eat them, so either I have to wait for the birds to get them, or use my lawnmower to try and pick them up, or just deal with the mess. So I know previously I mentioned I wouldn't get a dwarf peach. I probably wouldn't get a dwarf mulberry either. I want something with the bigger fruits that is not such a labor intensive to harvest. But this particular one is going to go from a mulberry tree to a mulberry bush later in this season. That said, this is another one of those trees where if you think you have a black thumb, you can plant one of these and it'll grow just fine.
So over here I've got an acerola cherry, and I absolutely love the flavor of this acerola cherry. It takes the full sun. I don't really have to deal with it very much. It's nice and evergreen. The flowers are pretty, the fruit is pretty. It is chock full of vitamin C. There's really not anything bad that I can say about this plant. The only thing that I might change is I kind of wish I would have shaped it up a little bit bigger, or a little bit better rather. It's kind of a little unruly right now, and I think I can trim it up to make it more attractive. But if you just want a wild looking bush that makes crazy berries, this acerola might be a good option.
Here next to the house, I've got a blackberry vine. This is a Primark 45 thornless blackberry, and as you can see, some of the blackberries are ready for harvest. This I would almost consider a perennial because it shoots up canes. This cane here that's fruiting now is the third one that's come off of the initial one I planted, and this will have the fruit for next year. The only thing I would change about this is I would have put it somewhere that got a little more afternoon sun. By the time the berries are ready for harvest, which is late April, early May, the afternoon sun will scorch the berries, and it's just not a very good mouthfeel. I mean, it tastes okay, but you'll have a nice blackberry with like a little dry, crunchy bit, which is kind of suboptimal. But other than that, these grow just fine, and they keep coming back year after year. I would definitely train them up on something like an arbor. I've seen them just laying on the ground or on a wall. But it's something that they can get pretty heavy, so I would definitely recommend a sturdy structure for them to climb on. So that's everything that I've got in the backyard right now. Just a typical suburban house in an HOA, but I've got over a dozen trees that are growing right now that I get to harvest off of throughout the year. I really want to stress that there are plenty of trees, even in Arizona, even with our full sun, that can take all the extreme temperatures and even some of the chilly winters, and you don't have to be a tree person or a plant person or have any kind of special powers to get to grow. Really, if you pick the right trees, you have a really high potential for success. So I would definitely encourage you to get out and plant something. You can even plant in the middle of the summer as long as you have water and some good soil and some mulch being the key. You can do it. I promise you can do it. If you have any questions, feel free to put them down in the comments. We just recently passed 1,000 subscribers, so thank you very much for people that are interested in the content that I have to say. I hope it's valuable to you, and I hope I can pass along some more information to help you be successful.